Hello, and welcome to Mint and Burn, the academic analysis of blockchain and other technologies in the decentralized digital economy. I'm your host, Kelsey Nabin, and we are tuning in partially remotely from the RMIT University Blockchain Innovation Hub to bring you interesting guests, publications, and experts to test frontier ideas. Today, we're talking to the DeFi expert Luca Cosentino from Oasis Labs on DeFi and data markets, alongside distinguished Professor Jason Potts and Associate Professor Chris Berg from the RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, start by kind of framing some context for us, if you would, about Oasis Lab and the kind of founder story out of Berkeley University.
Yeah, sure. So I may start from my background because it helps frame how I got to Berkeley and how I got to Oasis Labs. Like it's a path more than a one-off event. Um, so that goes back to 2013 when I was an intern in a primary payments company, and I started playing with Bitcoin a little bit because I opened a newspaper online, like an online magazine, and I found out about Bitcoin. I said, let me read about this. Found it interesting. It was a $300 back then, and it made the news because really it hit like $300, which was a massive milestone at that time. And I went to my like VPs and asked them, "Hey, like, shall I research about this a little bit? Shall I inform the team about this new thing so that they know?" And they said, like no, not at all. We don't know what this is. Just focus on your slides. Say, okay, cool. And given that these people had like years of experience in payments, I said they may have seen like more and more cycles in innovation in payments, so they must know. So I really took their words for granted and didn't invest any time in it. The only thing that I've done is like I bought a couple of Bitcoin just to start playing with it and familiarize with the experience, and it felt really good to have ownership of this money. Um, I didn't keep this Bitcoin um, since then, simply because in my family, I'm Italian, but in my family, whenever you make more than zero point 0.1 return on your money, they probably think if you make more than that, like your parents tell you it's probably a scam. You should be aware, and and you need to sell as quick as possible. So that's what I did. Flash forward to a couple of iterations of Bitcoin later, and finding myself studying for my MBA at UC Berkeley. I also get in touch with the community of blockchain at Berkeley, which I'd say was one of the probably like first and biggest communities in blockchain in the world. And so that gave me an opportunity to do essentially a couple of things that I didn't do before. The first one was spending more time reading the white papers and the technical aspects of blockchain. Clearly, Ethereum was probably the first white paper after Bitcoin that I read, and then I experienced this craziness of the ICO, which also means that I had the opportunity to read more and more white papers on a daily basis. And so I found myself like instead of following MBA classes, just pretending that I was actually following what the professor was saying, but really like reading white papers. It was a very fun experience. But the important moment was when I had this idea. Like this idea came to mind, which was coming from my previous experience working in large enterprises. I previously worked at American Express, Procter and Gamble, and Google, and I always experienced this world where users take certain actions either online or in whatever business the company is in, and then an employee there has to access this data to do something, right? And I'd say while the data is treated very carefully inside these organizations, at the same time, there is this weird trade-off between securing and using the data, which is you as an employee need access to the data. And so the first thing you do on your first day is that you send a ton of requests to someone based in someone else's in some other locations to get access to these tables because you want to do your job. And this person, without knowing anything about you, needs to approve or decline your request based maybe on a sentence, right? Which is like, I need the data to do this sales analysis, right? Um, And I thought that was very inefficient because I say like, why companies spend all this money to secure the data if then the first employee that joins the company, maybe as an intern or whatever, has access to all these tables? That makes no sense to me, right? If I had malicious intentions, I could join the company and then get the data and then leave the company 3 months later. That made no sense to me. And so when I was reading blockchain and I was reading about this ability of programming information and establishing policies of some kind via smart contracts, I had this wow moment where I said, maybe I can solve this problem actually using blockchain. And so I can think of this situation where a black box can be put in between two entities that need to share information, not just employees of the same company, but also company to company, or maybe different organizations of the same company. So I said, if I create this black box and I put it in between these sort of data sharing entities, maybe I can solve a big problem, right? And so while the data stays in this black box and lives there, the computation actually goes to the data rather than the data goes to the computation, if that makes sense. And that's sort of the very high level and not fully formed idea that I had, but I had like a couple of very use cases in mind, right? One example is when the customer links the credit card on the Amazon website, let's say the American Express card on the Amazon website, there could be a partnership between American Express and Amazon because it's in everyone's interest that you get better product recommendation based on your previous purchases. It's in Amazon's interest, it's in American Express interest, and it's in the user interest to do that. But this thing doesn't really happen because 50 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 10 years ago, you signed this policy at American Express that says your data is never going to be transferred somewhere else. And this sort of causes this weird tension point that can be solved by this technology. So I start googling like privacy preserving experts and maybe because I was at Berkeley, the first result that I get was Professor Domsong, who was working on something extremely similar, but I didn't know when I reached out to her. I asked her like, "Hey, can you help me develop this?" And she responded, "Look at what we just released." And they like 3 days before they released this white paper, which was the very first implementation of what then became Oasis Labs. So like joining forces seemed very obvious, and from there it has been more of a traditional company building exercise. So I've been the first employee there after the very initial funding engineering team, and I've been there since. So we launched this decentralized network, and then are also building this abstraction for enterprises.
Did you finish your MBA?
I did because I mean I managed to work almost full time in all my second year, and I did that by taking like weekend classes, evening classes, or things like that. It wasn't remote at that time, so I had to show up. But
Nice. I think we have a bunch of questions based on what you've said already. Jason?
Yeah, Luca, that was fascinating. For us, blockchain at Berkeley was also actually one of the foundations for the development of the Blockchain Innovation Hub. We were there, I think, in 2017, and it was just an incredible experience to see just the energy of what was going on. I think we saw Algorand launch live on stage at that time. Um, what I'm fascinated by in terms of your sort of insight into the business opportunity here was that you saw it initially as solving a privacy problem of sort of B2B, employee to employee inside organizations, which is a huge, obvious global, just hard problem that's everywhere. Did you also see it as from the beginning as an opportunity for machine? The counterparty could be a machine accessing this data for machine learning algorithms, or sort of seeing this as the beginning of data markets? Like, was the whole sort of vision there right at the beginning, or were you just seeing it very much as a solving the privacy problem, the security and privacy problem of data?
yeah, that's a good question. If you think about the example I referenced before, the one about two companies sharing data, really what that was purely machine learning based. because you need to build your machine learning recommendation model to suggest the final customer what products he or she may be interested in. So in fact, I thought much less about an internal policy manager tool and much more about this black box that could return this output of a certain machine learning model, because essentially the assumption was when you run your machine learning model, you really don't care about the underlying data. Clearly, you need to ensure the data integrity, the quality. You need to pre-process the data. All these things are things that you need to do. But assuming that this is not a concern in a slightly idealistic world, you don't really care about owning the data. You only care about running a model and taking the parameters. Now there are multiple ways to do it. There's federated learning, solve this problem a little bit, but again, here the point is not training model in many different places, but having the data live in one place, have the model run inside this data, and then or inside this data black box, and then the model and the parameters leave the black box while the data stays there. And there's a little bit more than this in the architecture of the Oasis network. We can talk about it, but I think this is an analogy that, despite containing a few errors and a few limitations, still conveys the message.
So, Luca, I mean, from your perspective, what is the size of this problem? So you've spelt out a really, what I think is a very compelling particular use in that environment. But how do you see the evolution of the large scale data privacy challenge as it stands? Has it changed since you began this journey? Where do you see it heading? And so how do you see Oasis fitting into that changing market?
Yeah, this is a very good question. And maybe a good way to answer this is thinking of where we are today, then scaling it up to what the vision looks like, and then imagining what are the steps to sort of bridge the gap between today and the future. So right now we if you observe the data market in general, right, which I'm not even sure it could be called a market, because data owners, which should be consumers, don't really have a way to do anything with their own data, right? But let's call it data market for a second. So there is an immense amount of data that is produced every day, and users are the main data producers of this immense um, of this incredible resource that is not yet a factor of production but should be, right? The problem in when you observe products, the problem that is generated is that people who build product prioritize by the most urgent needs that consumers and users have. And consequently, the way of operating is they observe the market, they observe the user behavior, and they take decisions based on that. But what happens at the same time is that, um, given that there is no product that offers people the ability to own their own data, also, if you observe what happens, you observe that people don't care about owning their data, right? It's a very straightforward conclusion, but it's not that obvious until you think about it. And
People
so
don't care about owning their data because they've got no way to own their data, basically.
that's right.
Yeah.
And if you look at history, right, and you look at 3,000 years of history, and you put privacy in context, right, what you notice is, whenever there was a trade-off between convenience and privacy, or accessibility of a service and privacy, people prefer accessibility and sacrifice privacy. But whenever a privacy preserving option came up, they always defaulted to the second one, to the privacy one. And this goes back to really very broad topics, such as having sex in public rather than inside your own house before you have walls, to something a little bit more recent, which is having your telephone in a big room with a bunch of other people that were necessarily listening at what you were saying, to switching to headphones right after they came up, right? As a need to protect you from an environment.
Yeah, the way I've always thought about it in that context, and I've done a fair bit of work on the history of privacy, is that privacy is always a bolt-on after the initial innovation. So if you think about the telephone, privacy becomes a bolt-on after we have party lines, because the early adopters, it's hard to build in those privacy technologies on the face of it, but with the internet we're sort of lagging well behind that privacy adoption curve. And I think technologies like Oasis, even technologies just like Zcash, for example, start building back in the privacy that in an ideal world would have been put in the internet on day one. But over time, the demand for that has returned and the technology has evolved.
That's right. And in fact, now you're seeing some examples of what you're saying, right? Whenever, like, good examples could be messaging platforms, and you're seeing some people deviating to a more privacy preserving product. You're seeing the same with maybe some first examples of very sensitive data, such as genomics. Happy to talk about a use case we are supporting in that space. But you're not going to see it on you're not going to see it in places where the incentives are not aligned, right? Credit cards, like, what do you want? Do you want me to move around with like cash instead of using credit cards, not to give data away? Or you want me not to be on Facebook when 99% of my friends are on Facebook, and the social life happens there? That's not going to happen in like overnight. So the incentives need to be restructured, and I'm happy to talk about the way we see it at Oasis
Yeah,
Labs.
I think it would be really interesting to get into use cases. Before we dive a little bit deeper, you guys did a token launch for the Rose token on the Oasis protocol. What was that process for you, and what is the function of the token in relation to privacy and data that we've spoken about?
Yeah. So the architecture of the Oasis network, or actually, let me step back and tell you why Oasis exists. I think it's something we haven't covered, right? Um, so when the project of Oasis was designed, basically there was only Ethereum as a network, and maybe a few others, but mainly Ethereum. And the biggest problem that was clear back then was that putting everything publicly on the blockchain wouldn't really optimize for adoption in the real world, because um, having all the information public significantly limits what people and companies can actually do. And not because they want to hide information. This means that they are doing something illegal, right? It simply means that they need to protect something that is sensitive, or something that cannot be revealed to the market, or something that needs to stay confidential within the walls of that transaction, or a commercial agreement. And the second problem that was very clear back in time was the same that is still here today, which is the low scalability that has evolved in different ways, right? But still is a concern for blockchain space. And so we thought of how can we solve this problem in a way that it's usable by the real world, right? In production, let's say that's probably a better terminology. And so we thought of this architecture that could ensure scalability and privacy, but at the same time support the complexity of the transaction. A lot of projects start talking about TPS, transaction per second, as a one metric. We think it's an imperfect metric because it doesn't capture what transaction we're talking about, right? Is it me sending money to you, or is like a deep learning model running in a decentralized fashion, right? Those are very different transactions. So in order to solve these goals, we decided that the market was proposing these secure enclaves, these like black box powered by Intel, called Intel SGX, which is this piece of hardware that runs already on some devices such as the iPhone or the MacBook, etc. And it allows um, to do what I was describing before, which is putting the data in this confined environment where the model can work, and if there's any attempt to break that zone, the system breaks. The problem without decentralization is that you would rely on that one piece of hardware And given that it's not open source, you don't really know what's in there, right? So you don't really know if it's cheating on you, if it's doing something that it shouldn't be doing. You don't have visibility of that. But what happens with blockchain and with the decentralization level is that you don't have to rely on the hardware, because you will have independent nodes that will validate that computation for you. And if they agree on a certain criteria, then it means that that computation is actually performed correctly. So we really enable this architecture that is both scalable and private by creating this separation of the main layers of blockchain, which are consensus and compute layer. At the compute layer, we enable this the execution of parallel runtimes, which we call paratimes, which are sort of independent blockchains that can run again independently, but that are coordinated by this consensus layer. And the consensus layer is a network of independently selected nodes. They are 80 plus. We are scaling up to 200. They run the validator role on behalf of the Oasis network, and they're compensated by transaction fees. And so this is the primary answer to your question, which is why do you need ROSE? In first principle, you need ROSE to, and ROSE is the name of the token because it's an ancient symbol of privacy. But ROSE is this token that is used to access the consensus layer. We're now releasing an upgrade that allows the token to enter the paradigm. And so it will be used inside applications that are built on top of these paradigms. And for application, you can think of any type of use case, but we have some angle specific on DeFi and this idea of like these data markets that we referenced before.
I'm right in saying it's a Tendermint consensus. So will it be integrated with the rest of the Cosmos sort of ecosystem in that sense?
So we use an implementation of the Tendermint consensus, but for now we are not building on top of the Cosmos SDK. We are starting to focus on bridging our network with Ethereum. So we are bridging there, but we are discussing supporting these other implementations. Right now, the closest we are doing is building a Cosmos equivalent internal implementation of that SDK to have our paradigms talk to each other as if they were one big network, which indeed they are. But the goal is enabling developers not to take the decision of which paradigm they want to build on early on, which is a problem that a lot of blockchains have, no matter what architecture they have, because it's always this trade-off between like supporting the Ethereum virtual machine, which is adopted but inefficient, or maybe switching to something a little bit more flexible, such as the WebAssembly framework that may enable developers to be a little bit more flexible, but clearly that requires a little bit more effort to learn and to ramp up. And so like you wanna break this barrier and make developers at ease when they build an application that maybe uses some contracts on the Ethereum virtual machine, but also some other contracts on another development framework.
So it'd be interesting to talk about some of these use cases, and you've suggested one that is quite of interest to us because we've been thinking a lot about the use of blockchain for healthcare, particularly managing data markets in healthcare. And you mentioned you're supporting a genomics project. It'd be really interesting to hear about that and what you see that use case and benefits is.
Can I just ask just a question just to follow up on that around how you see the difference between data markets for healthcare, like me selling my health data, versus donating it or pooling it or just creating a sort of scientific commons for data, or just whether you see those as contradictory approaches in this space, because I think we're seeing a lot of very different attitudes towards property rights in data, depending upon the use cases. So transactions data, I'll sell you mine, but health data, there is a sense in which you're contributing data for the common good, for scientific advances to be used. So are you seeing that distinction between different architectures or property rights or institutions for governing the data in relation to the different use cases that are opening up?
Yeah, both are very interesting points, and I think they're very close to the way we think about data at Oasis. But I'd say we I'd say we approach the problem from a slightly different point of view that then ends up in serving the two use cases that you just described. So the way we see it is not really who pays for the data or what is the business model around data, but who has ownership of the data and control of the data. Because if you solve that problem, then solving the problem of whether companies should pay or not to access this data becomes much easier, right? And I'd say becomes a choice that the application can take later and can also switch over time. So the way we see it is data right now, like think about the default, right? The default is there is data that is produced, and then this data is stored in a database, right? Or in a place that contains this data. What's the problem? The problem is that who owns this database? Um, the generally the companies, and in those companies, you are a row in a data set, or at least in structured data um, in structured databases. But so you are a row in a data set, or maybe like many rows in many databases. Um, so this causes two problems. One, all your data is not in one place. So even if you request to delete the data, that's also complicated because they need to go and match these primary keys that live in multiple places. So the best you can hope for is that they delete your email or some very sensitive information because it's easy to spot, but everything you actually produce online may actually still be with the company even when you ask them to delete to delete the data. Think of a different approach, which is the way we think about it. We created these things called like capsules, which are these entities that capture the data once the data is produced and store the data in a in this place that belongs to the user, not to the company. So we invert the model. And what happens is that the company will get access to that data if the user wants, which may be specified within the consent of the registration to that application, right? So you can still imagine a scenario where you register the same way you do now, but within that process, you give consent to that company to use your data, but the data doesn't go in their database, it goes in your capsule. Um, why this is important? Because related to the privacy aspect that I mentioned before, even when data is accessed, the data is not revealed or transferred to the company, which is the biggest problem that every non-privacy preserving network or cloud has, is that if someone can see your data, that means that you're transferring ownership of that data because you need to trust their behavior. And you don't have to trust the behavior now, but you'll have to trust this behavior over many years. Um, which explains really well why the very first use cases that we're seeing are around the most sensitive data, which is DNA data, because the data produced today is the same data that is going to be there like 50 years from now. And people cannot take choices now based on what's happening in 50 years or in 10 years. So before jumping into the use case of genomics, let's stay 1 second on the capsule, right? So the capsule keeps your data, you give access, and then all you need to do now is defining why users should give you access to that data. So now all of a sudden, from a technology problem, it became an incentive problem. And if you switch the incentive scheme or the incentive structure, what now happens is that companies um, will not keep behaving the same way they're behaving now, which is when they're small, they do whatever they can to attract users and to collaborate with users because they're small, they are collaborative, they're the best customer support and all these things. And then once they grow, the marginal importance of that user, of the nth user, is lower and lower and lower, and so they can switch towards a more exploitative attitude to their users. But if they still have to give their users a reason to access their data, they cannot afford to be like exploitative, right? They need to be collaborative with their users. And then, like up to this point, if it's clear up to this point, then we can discuss what could be the right incentive. And back to your question, it could be like examples where money is the way to set this transaction, or maybe it could be like supporting causes, and that would be similar to the real world, like why do people do something. Maybe that's a field that you know much better than I do, but this could be like a question that should be answered to answer the stage. So I pause it here. I curious to see if there are questions. If not, I'll jump into the DNA genomics example. Yeah.
So, on that point, in the capsule model that you've described, users are creating the data that they own. But how does this marketplace work when a third party wants to create data on users still? Because at the moment, the kind of data economy and privacy in that respect is that the person that creates the data, no matter who they are, owns it.
And when you say create the data, you mean the data is created from the actions of the users, or you mean that um, if Google Maps creates data, the data belongs to Google?
So if I have a website and you visit it, I create the data about your behavior, but I collect that data on you and I store it and it's mine to benefit from.
I see. Okay, so this is an interesting question because there are multiple forces that are playing here, right? And the way we see it is this one. There is the technology force, which is enabling a new model of collaboration that didn't really exist before. The second one is the incentives to switch to this user-based or user-owned web, right? Which is mainly closer to blockchain. And the third one is the competitive advantage that companies plan to have by offering functionalities that are appealing to their users. And the first and biggest example that you're seeing in the market now is probably Apple. And Apple is doing a ton to protect the user's data, also because they're incentivized to do it because they make competitors' life a little harder. Um, but but people are becoming aware of what this means now, right? And when data privacy is granted, it's hard to go back because it's like someone puts a dress on you and then all of a sudden removes it, and you feel like awkward, right? You feel that you need that dress, which is also what history sort of teaches. Um, so what we are seeing is that more and more startups and larger players are interested in giving users some level of control over their data. Even if you think about a very famous case in the US, Plaid, um, they are a fintech player that connects a fintech app to the bank and allows a user to extract some information from the bank so that the app can give like better recommendation, can see if you're paying hidden fees and or if you can use another credit card and a bunch of other use cases. So they collect a ton of data in the process. And last year or 2 years ago, they released this dashboard that shows you how your data is used. So you can put your primary key, you go there and you see these are the applications that have access to your data. So all of these are steps forward, are not the definitive solution, but they're step forwards. And so we think that while by the time the market realizes that they want more and more control, also new application will be in the market, and so bigger players will be at risk of losing a significant part of the user base if they don't catch up with that information. Like Google now is removing cookies, it's enabling this like confidential compute system via this private implementation of TensorFlow. Like you're seeing a ton of movement um, under the hood. It's a little bit hidden because it's like not a consumer facing product. Maybe the case of Apple it is, but you're seeing that happening. So the what we expect is that more and more companies will come with the desire of putting customers in control of their data as a strategy to retain or acquire new customers. And we want to make the trade-off of doing so for companies very small because of what we said at the very beginning, which is companies may not necessarily want the data, but they want what they can do with the data. And if they can do the same thing while also reducing their liability, reducing the risks of data breaches and all these things, that could be an incentive model that works for everyone.
What do you see as the role of government in this? Because we've got a situation where, I mean, what you've just described was the market responding to consumers' desire for privacy. You know, Apple is a great example of that. In the EU, you've got the sort of GDPR regulation that's driving a lot of this sort of government deciding this is the level of privacy around data that everyone, all our citizens must have, and companies needing to comply with that. What's your view on? And then China's a whole different story again around that. Like, what's your view on whether government is leading or following or an essential player in this, or just fundamentally getting in the way of market responses, or just how do you view this yeah, this regulatory question?
Well, I'd say here the European regulators have probably been the strongest force in making this very annoying thing called GDPR public and interesting to everyone, right? Um, I remember that newsletter, or sorry, not newsletter, that email push that every company had to do in Europe was really like as annoying as effective to make everyone aware that their data was sort of used in a weird way, right? So I think the regulator has an immense power, um, and when we talk to American companies who like they're not necessarily they're not historically good at protecting users' data, but there is such a great awareness that something is going to change in the next future that really everyone is receptive and looking at solutions in the market to offer something to their consumers. And I guess the intersection point is while companies have an opportunity to put users in control by also reducing their liability, their exposure to data breaches, and any other like data related problems. Again, the only thing that needs to be done there is that all of this process needs to happen without significant problems or significant loss of performance for these companies. And I think that's very doable because if you take what you can do with any open data set that you may manage, you remove what the government said you cannot do, you remove what the government in multiple geographies are saying you cannot do, you're already out at a stage that is extremely close to what you can do with like privacy preserving computation. And so the only missing step is changing this incentive model. Um, so yeah, this is to me this is a fascinating argument. As a company, we cannot rely too much on the government because we don't know when this is going to happen, to what intensity, with what intensity. So we need to find a story that is convincing for enterprises and users at the same time. Now that's what we're trying to do. But thank God there are. It seems that the timing is really good because again, like the last 5 years, I've probably made it clear to everyone the importance of data. Maybe like the Cambridge Analytica was probably the starting point of how a super simple and kind of um, yeah, like a super simple like collaboration model between two companies 10 years before can result in like a massive effect 10 years later. That was totally
And you're
unexpected.
talking about the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal there for reference.
Yeah.
Chris?
Do you see risks though? So we've got so the GDPR was really the first major semi-global piece of regulation to cover off the privacy. And one of the arguments about the GDPR is that it locks in different models or different ideas of data ownership that aren't necessarily the right ones. Regardless of where you stand on the privacy debate, both certainly free marketeers and progressives don't really think that the GDPR captures the idea of privacy. Do you sort of see a challenge then, or do you see any risk that government may intervene in a way that distorts that otherwise market-driven evolution of the ideas about privacy, or is it all to the better?
Well, we are as a company, we're not, let's say, regulation experts. So it's hard for me to answer this question. One thing I noticed here is that um, GDPR limits this a little bit, limits the innovation startups can do. That's the one thing I've noticed,
Mhm.
because GDPR starts from understanding start from the very first user that a startup deals with, and so a startup doesn't really innovate well without experimenting and testing. So maybe this makes me think that not everything that the government does will possibly work in the like best possible direction. I think it's done with the best intentions. Then of course the effects may be bigger than this.
It would be good to we've danced around. It'd be good to hear about the genomics thing, and it would also be interesting to hear about your views on DeFi. But tell us about the genomics project, because that sounds absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. So the the most valuable data we have is arguably the genomics data, again because it's very personal, identifiable, it's not really changing over time, and a ton of information can be extracted from there, and also like more and more, right? If you do your test today or 10 years from now, the result is going to look like incredibly different. And the risk is that people are not aware of this, and so all these genomics companies that were promoting DNA testing, DNA kits to know where your family is from, I think like communicated the wrong message to people, and didn't really do a great job at teaching people what the implications of this test was. This company called Nebula, that we're very proudly working with, is approaching the problem from the same angle, but also from the um, angle of wanting to respect the privacy and the future implication of users. And so what they're saying is, we give a DNA test, you take it, but the data is yours. And it's not only yours, but it's also private. In the process of registering, you give us consent to use the data for some analysis or whatever we need to deliver the service to you. Maybe if you want, we can share your data with some pharma companies to develop drugs, so you can help someone else. But in no case the data is revealed and transferred, because the implications are huge. And this is again another example of they're basing their own value proposition exactly on this. They're charging user for the service, so everyone is happy to have this transaction. The testing that they're doing are great. They're maybe planning to switch the entire offering to this. Right now, it's a separate flow from people who want the extra level of privacy, and it's working really well. We're very happy. That's exactly what we want. It empowers this vision of this responsible data economy. Now, the next step will be, what do people do with the data once they have it? And so, why a pharma company should access it if they make money on the final product, why they should not pay the inputs, right? And so, what we're thinking is creating these protocols for decentralized lending of data. I don't know if you're familiar with maybe like Compound, right? For money, which is this implementation, this lending protocol where borrowers and lenders can meet and exchange money. I mean, the borrower and the lender via an interest rate that is automatically calculated by the supply and demand, right? We're thinking of doing the same thing with the data. And so the point is, my data is valuable just because there is someone else in the world who is willing to take it, buy it, use it, or borrow it. And so the idea is users will be able to go and stake their data. Um, um, y- Someone else will see what data is available, will come and will pay the price that is determined by how much people are willing to pay, and how much like the sellers are ready to, or actually the lenders are ready to lend. And we envision this being done in a very automatic and programmatic way, without the negotiation between the two parties, without the contracting, and without the invoicing piece. All of this will be powered by smart contracts, and will be incentivized by the real demand for this data.
Okay, so this is where we build a world of DeFi and data markets, to use the words of Chris, where it starts to get interesting.
It's a super it's super interesting, because data markets are something that on the when you first hear about them sounds like a sort of interesting abstraction. but the idea of having a marketplace of data outside specialized data brokers is actually quite novel. And to the extent that we're moving away from a sort of dark pools of data or dark markets of data into, well, we can have privacy preserving, we can have high frequency, high liquidity data pools that really anybody can access openly, as long as they're abiding by the conditions of which that data is sold. I think that's a super interesting thing, and it resolves a lot of the problems that we have when we're trying to think about how can we give people more control. As you say, people don't value things that they have no control over, if or cannot monetize. You can't get value out of something if it can't be valued by others. So I think it's a super interesting idea.
There's another interesting aspect to this, that sort of going in this direction of creating an asset or a market good means that instead of regulating it through, or instead of governing it through regulation, you can govern it through taxation or accounting codes. It becomes an asset on the books, and you can create, you can affect the incentives to hold it or to share it or otherwise by playing with the price of data, which is a really interesting new concept. I mean, is this how you conceive the world we're entering into? Is just a world where data becomes a resource? This is an idea you talked about earlier, but not just a resource, but a global resource that's just doubling in size every 3 months, that becomes more and more of an asset for companies, and an individual asset for individuals, and also for nations, I guess, to sort of start. I mean, is that how you foresee the world we're entering into, or is...
Yeah, that's how I see it. I think at the beginning I said that data should be a factor of production in my mind, because it's really used the same way other elements are used, right, to produce outputs. Now there is this interesting analogy that has been promoted, I think, by the economists back in time, which was data is the new oil. I even think it's better than that, because when you have like two barrels of oil, when you have like one barrel of oil and you add the second one, you have two. And but when you have one data set and you add another data set, you don't have two, you have more than that, because the more data you intersect, the more valuable the data becomes. So it's even better than that. Whether this should be an asset on the balance sheet, I have mixed feelings, because it's kind of like counterintuitive and opposite to what I said before. But at the same time, I think it creates the wrong incentives, and it's sort of like the companies are incentivized to collect more and more data. So there must be something in between, to these. So I see it as an asset, but I'm afraid that giving the power of putting it on the balance sheet will create this weird dynamic, which is, yeah, I want more. But you can make the same argument on much broader topics, like even the GDP doesn't capture innovation well, right? Like, so it's probably too broad,
Yeah,
right?
well, I think the other difference between data and oil is one is a finite resource, and one is kind of infinite, to Jason's point. So when you're incentivizing people to create data because of the ways that they can then stake it, as you've pointed out, you're kind of just able to create more and more and more. We've covered a fair bit of ground, and it feels like only an introduction to Oasis protocol here. Where can people go to find out more and keep in touch with what you're up to?
Our main channels are Twitter and Telegram. We have a few communities there in many different like languages, and also some of them are also like thematic. We also publish regular updates to our community via the newsletter and via the Medium blog post. Generally, the website is oasisprotocol.org, and that's a great starting point. If you want to know more about the enterprise efforts and products, oasislabs.com is probably the best place. But again, oasisprotocol.org is and contains everything related to community. We do regular AMAs that are generally specific around certain topics. Most of them are on Telegram, so people can go and ask questions and have a chat. We have an ambassador program for maybe students or people who want to be part of and support the network in a different way. And then we have a grant program which helps smaller projects get off the ground, start playing with the network, like propose applications and start interact with them without absorbing the cost of doing so. And this is again on the website. But also personally, I'm very able to take like calls or conversations or messages. So and I'm very open, and I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, and all these modern media communication channels. So yeah, we love when people give us feedback, ideas, or any type of input from the outside is really
Great. And I should add that you have quite a broad universities program as well. As in terms of a disclaimer, we're actually a participant as a validator node in the network, although I think we're currently outside the active validator set. Final thoughts, Chris or Jason, before I say our farewells?
No, this is super interesting. I think it's an understated topic in the blockchain space, but it's obviously really fundamental to so many of our conversations that we're having about, social media, about our interactions with global capitalism. I think it's awesome work, and I'm really keen to keep following your project.
Yeah, we're very excited to be following what you're doing, and I mean, right from the beginning, we've always been incredibly excited about this idea of how this technology just completely changes the economics of data, and that's in many exciting and good ways. Um, so congratulations on the mainnet launch, and your token
thank
is
you.
doing very nicely as well. I see. So well done.
Yeah, it's running pretty smoothly. Like even the upgrade has been great. So the technical foundation of what we have is it received a lot of positive feedback from people in the space, but also like developers and users. So we're very proud of that.
Awesome. So thank you, Luca, and also to RMIT experts, Chris Berg and Jason Potts. And thank you for joining us for this episode of Mint and Burn. You can check out the show notes and further research at rmitblockchain.io.